And he said, John, there's nothing I can sell here. This is a worthless company. I really struggled to hear that. It was it was a seven-figure business. We probably, it was actually more than $1 million in profit a year. So I thought going into that meeting, it was a very valuable asset. And he was telling me effectively all I had was a job. And so that kicked off what has been a 20-year sort of odyssey for me to learn about what does drive the value of a company.
Nobody really talks about the transfer of value, right?
I think it was 74% of business owners who exit within 1 year are depressed or sad about their outcome.
Yeah.
And when we unpacked that data, we discovered that the reason they're unhappy, one of the reasons that they're unhappy, is that they were all push and no pull.
A very warm welcome to the Creative Dealmaker podcast. I'm Carl Allen, I'm your host, and I'm going to be interviewing expert guests sharing investor strategies that will completely and utterly disrupt the market when it comes to buying and selling businesses all over the world.
So hey guys, it's Carl Allen. Welcome to the Creative Dealmaker podcast. Got a very, very special guest on my show today. It's none other than John Warrillow. And I'll let John talk about his background in a minute, but you guys know how much I love this book. This book is going to teach you everything about how to get a business ready for sale so that someone's going to really appreciate it and pay what's hopefully going to be a premium valuation for it. So John, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Carl.
So obviously, you're an author, you've built and exited 4 businesses, you have the incredible value builder system. But just for my listeners and viewers that probably don't know as well as I do, just give them a few minutes on your backstory. Where did you come from? What have you done? And what's your focus here on in?
Yeah, I built and sold 4 companies, most recent of which was a business that I thought was very valuable. And I went to see an M&A guy and asked him, what do you think it's worth? And he said, well, it depends on the answer to a couple of questions. I said, shoot. And he said, well, who does the work in your company? Like, who actually oversees the production of the service that we were offering? And I said, well, I'm involved in overseeing that. And he said, all right, well, number 2, who does the selling? And I was the chief salesperson for the company. We sold to very large enterprise companies, Microsoft, Bank of America, et cetera. And he said, John, there's nothing I can sell here. This is a worthless company. I really struggled to hear that. It was a 7-figure business. We probably, it was actually more than $1 million in profit a year. So I thought going into that meeting, it was a very valuable asset. And he was telling me effectively all I had was a job. And so that kicked off what has been a 20-year sort of odyssey for me to learn about what does drive the value of a company. That business, ultimately, we changed it. We moved it to a subscription model. We brought in a sales team, and ultimately it was acquired by a New York Stock Exchange listed company. So it sort of had a happy ending in the end, but it was a very tumultuous time. So with Value Builder, we help business owners understand and ultimately realize the value of their company. And so that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think this is the single biggest problem that we have today in the United States for the tens of thousands of baby boomers every week that are looking to exit their businesses and transition on to to something else. A lot of them, you just hit on it, they work more in their business tactically rather than on their business strategically. And people only look at valuation in terms of numbers, right? They say, hey, what's my recasted EBITDA? And what's the market multiple? And what are my add backs? And do I need to top up my working capital? All that stuff, right? And yeah, we need that. We need those foundational answers to those questions, but nobody really talks about the transfer of value, right? We all know that a business has an enterprise value, multiple of EBITDA plus or minus, and it has a liquidation value, right? It has the value if the business owner turns off the lights and walks away. And the difference, the goodwill, if you will, is built up of those different pillars. It's the human capital in the business. Is it owner dependent? It's the quality of the systems and processes. It's the culture, the brand, the recognition in the marketplace. And I applaud you for building the business that you've built to not only educate sellers and other deal intermediaries through that journey, but ultimately help them drive the value that they need to see so they can retire and transition and have a quality of life that, that they want to have.
Yeah, you use the word retire. Interestingly, I think some owners go through this process because they want to retire. I think many more actually don't want to retire. I think they want to get on with the next chapter of their life. And that could mean for many of them another business. We've seen a lot of them want to do a philanthropic project. We've seen even people that want to go work for a company and just alleviate the stress of running a business.
Yeah.
And I think we go out of our way to talk about, this issue is not about retiring, and it's not about, selling and sitting on the beach. You can want to exit and go do something else. That's okay. In fact, I did a podcast interview with a guy named Joey Redner, who built a great business, Cigar City Brewing in Tampa Bay. They did like a craft beer, and it was a very, very, very capital intensive business. So over time, he built up a tremendous amount of debt to his father, to the SBA, to another bank. I mean, 3 tranches of debt. Even though it was an incredibly successful company, Joey just kind of pulled up and said, "This is crazy. I'm out." And he was a young man at the time, and he sold his business to Oscar Blues, went private equity backed, had a great outcome, had a great exit. And he'd be, his late 30s at the time when he had that exit. He's not going to retire, right? But he wanted to, number one, go do something else. Number two, de-risk, right? And I think that's an important thing for a lot of owners to think about, because so much of their wealth is tied up in their company. And it's not uncommon, for us to see a business or a situation where somebody's business represents, 60, 70, 80% of their net worth. They would never do that in a stock portfolio, right? Like you wouldn't have 80% of your stock in Google or Tesla. Nobody does that, right? But we do that every day when we run a company. And so I think there's some important things to think about as it relates to, diversifying, but it's not about retiring per se. It's more about thinking about what's your next chapter going to look like.
So I think that's right. So there's 3 really interesting points there I want to touch on. So the first one is, I love that data that a non-business owner, 50% of their net worth in bonds, 50% in stocks, real estate, and others. A business owner, I think the Exit Planning Institute had the same data as you. I think 70 to 80% is tied up in the value of their business, and the rest is whatever, right? And what's really interesting is people always talk about like that value gap, don't they? Right? So like there's 3 gaps in a business owner's life. They've got a profit gap, they've got a value gap, which is a higher level of profit based on being best in class multiplied by the best in class multiple for that sector. And then you've got that wealth gap, right? You've got the gap between, I think they use the rule of 4, don't they? So, if you need $400,000 a year, to comfortably retire, that's 4% yield on a $10 million net worth. Sometimes, they don't have the value in their business yet. And it's what do they have to do to be able to get them to that point in time? And then the other really interesting point is, like, what I don't see enough of, and I talk to probably 20 sellers a week. I'm doing a big roll up in the e-com space. I'm doing a big roll up in the engineering space, and I'm doing a big roll up in the coaching and services space. So I'm talking to business owners all the time, right? Some of them are off-market deals, and some of them are on-market deals. And what I find really interesting is that business owners don't have a mindset of value creation, right? Like they'll only think about value when they sell. They don't run their businesses around value creation, because like a lot of the business owners I talk to, they'll say, "Hey, Carl, I'm looking to sell." So the first question I always ask, why are you selling? Well, you know what? I hate this thing. And terrible for a negotiator like me to kind of hear that, because I'm like, okay. So it's like, I hate this thing. I'm spending too much time in this business, and, I don't like my employees, and I'm kind of done, right? But they haven't orchestrated a business model that can drive incredible value. And then when you get to that point, they might not want to sell, right? If you get to a point where you're working on your business, you're an owner investor, you're not an owner operator, you've got a management team that's running it, all the systems and process and KPIs, they're all really dialed in, whether they use Value Builder or eMyth or EOS or whatever, right? I think yours is the best, by the way. And then when you get to that point, if you're a business owner and you're making 7 figures a year, and you're spending 4 hours a week working on your business, not in your business, why would you sell it, right? Knowing that you just add more fuel to the engine and you can compound that value. So I'm not seeing that. I think there's a mindset shift needs to happen with the micro and the small cap business community to adopt this culture of value creation, whether they want to sell the business or not. Because if you drive value creation, you're going to have higher margins in your business. You're going to be worth a higher multiple. Your revenues are going to grow. You're going to have a more differentiated product or service. You're going to be able to capture more market share. I know that. You know that. You're the expert. Why are people doing that? It drives me crazy.
Interesting. That's quite a tirade.
I know. I talk to a lot of business owners. I'm like, dude, come on.
I don't know if I agree, to be honest. I think there is a cohort of owners that are income focused, right? They are using their business as a piggy bank. And for them, their ultimate report card is their profit at the end of the year. And that's a way to function a business. There's a lot of businesses that do that. I'm increasingly seeing the other side, though, which is a business owner who is building to sell. I mean, I wrote a book on it. You referenced at the beginning, like it's done pretty well. It's sold a lot of copies.
Read that book, viewers. Insane.
And thank you, Carl. But I think in part because it struck a nerve, which is this idea that I want to build an asset. I don't necessarily want to, go out boots first, as they say, and sell when I effectively die. Like that's not what I want to do. And I think there might be a bit of a generational thing too, Carl. Like I think we've seen this in the workforce in general. Baby boomers tend to have fewer jobs. They tend to have started with a company and will oftentimes retire with that company. Young people, that's a pipe dream. Like no young person today thinks they're going to retire with the company that they started with. And I think there's some of that sentiment among entrepreneurs. I think if you talk to entrepreneurs in their 30s and 40s, you're more likely to hear this sentiment of building to sell. Like I'm in this to kind of create something and then move to the next thing. I think there's a much more transient sort of ethos about it. It's much less paternal, right? Paternalistic business owners they tend to be more income focused, like father knows best kind of entrepreneurs, right? Who build a business, their employees are their family, and when they're ready to retire, they'll pass the business on to their kids or their management team or do an ESOP. Like that's a thing, right? But it tends to be an older business owner. I don't see it as much among a younger generation.
No, I think you're right. And like one of the things that's always intrigued me, and I've not seen any data on this, and I'd love your insight because you're at the cutting edge of this, is like for somebody that goes through like the value builder system, right? And they generate, premium valuation and they exit, great terms, a lot of cash at close. And like to go through that euphoria and that real kind of optimization of their business, do you find a lot of those people then decide to become like an angel investor and kind of deploy a bit of their capital that they've now got, plus that experience and that skill set to kind of help other people effectively go along the same journey, but then they get a piece of that upside, buying in at probably a lower valuation?
Yeah, I mean, some of our most successful advisors of Value Builder are former business owners. Glenn Grant comes to mind, built a great company. I interviewed him on Built Star Radio. I think he had 30 or 40 employees, software business, sold at a great multiple. Now he's a business coach. And it's not necessarily because he needs the money, but because he wants to give back and teach people what he learned and realizes that it's not super common out there. The thing about selling a company, and we've talked about this before, is that there is no kind of playbook. There is no simulator. I often equate it to, Sully landing that plane on the Hudson River. He had done everything there was to do in an airplane, yet he'd never landed an airplane on the Hudson River. That was something he had to do once. He had to grease the landing, and everything was at stake at 119 lives or whatever it is at stake. I think the same thing is true of most business owners. Like we get to write marketing plans and sell customers and deal with customer, satisfaction and write leases. Like we do those things repetitiously, right? So we get good at them.
Yeah.
Selling a company is only something you ever do once. And so once you have that experience, you kind of feel almost obliged to give it back, to pass it on. And so I think that's true. I think some people choose to do it as a hobby, others as a coach, others as an investor, as an angel investor. So yeah, I think I've seen all of those. I think it's actually one of the secrets to a satisfying exit. You referenced Exit Planning Institute. They did a piece of research a while back. I think it was 74% of business owners who exit within 1 year are depressed or sad about their outcome.
Yeah.
And when we unpacked that data, we discovered that the reason they're unhappy, one of the reasons that they're unhappy, is that they were all push and no pull. What do I mean by push versus pull? Push is the things you referenced, right? Like I'm frustrated with employees, like regulation, the government of the day, like I'm just frustrated, right? Those are all push factors. And we all have them when we think about, our business. And those are things that often cause people to want to sell. Pull factors are the things you're excited to go do next. Be an angel investor, for example, or start an incubator, for example. Kieran Merchant, I just interviewed him on the pod. He was a lifelong closet filmmaker. He grew up in India, came to the United States, and got involved in aviation consulting, helping airports design new terminals. And it was kind of a boring job, to lack of a better word, but he'd always had this sort of closet interest in filmmaking. And so by the age of 55, he'd built a great little 12-person consulting firm that helped these airports kind of create new terminals. And he decided to sell it. And why did he sell it? It was a great business, throwing off a lot of cash. It was because he was excited to go be a full-time filmmaker.
Yeah.
And the sale of the company gave him enough money to go do that. And so I think it's really a good best practice to get really clear about what's your next chapter look like. And once you do that, I think that's the raw material for a happier exit, regardless of what financial outcome you get.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, actually, because like I'm very early 50s now, and I keep getting asked by my family, when are you gonna retire and stop doing this? And kind of can't, because I love being a coach and educator. I love buying businesses, right? But like what's really interesting is, and you mentioned like the landing the plane on the Hudson River. Like obviously you're working on the sell side. I'm primarily working on the buy side of deals. And I coach my business buying students all the time about, when you're buying a business, like often if it's your first time, you've got the same emotions. Like you don't know what you don't know. And my analogy is like having children, right? So I've got two boys, they're 15 and 27, right? Bit of a gap. And I remember when my 27-year-old was born, like the anxiety, the nerves, the worry, just like, how am I going to be a good dad? Is the birth going to go well? How's it going to work? I didn't know, right? When the second guy came along, it was like, yeah, that's fine. Like out he came, went and had a beer, no problem at all. Because I'd been through it once, right? And like I feel for a lot of business owners that and you probably heard me talk about it before. I'm not a massive fan generally of the business broker community. I personally don't like dealing with brokers. I'd rather originate deals off market. I've developed some tactics to get in front of them and build relationships with them, right? I don't feel brokers do enough of a job preparing a seller for that sale. And I'm not just talking about, the business's, let's call it financial and strategic readiness, but I think it's that personal readiness as well, both in terms of have they got all their ducks in a row, but then have they thought about that afterlife? What do they actually want to do next? And I think until they have that future pacing of this is what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, I think that can hold a lot of business owners back from actually pulling the trigger. I've lost count of the number of deals I've got to the closing table, and the sellers just said, you know what, I can't do this. Like I have not. This will leave such a void in my life. I'm actually scared of what tomorrow is going to look like. I'm walking away from this deal, right? And there's no amount of bribery or sweetening of deal terms, that like what I should have done, and I do this now, is actually sit down with a seller before I even give them an LOI. I want to understand, do they have an afterlife, as I call it? What are you going to do next? Do you want to?
So funny you should mention that. We have an assessment tool called Prescore. We're best known for an assessment called Value Builder, but one of our most sort of hidden gems is this thing called Prescore. It stands for Personal Readiness to Exit. And it's an assessment survey that business owners take, and it asks them about their push factors, their pull factors, the type of deals they'd be open towards, and so forth. And we have an advisor in the Value Builder community who insists on business owners doing their pre-score. He will not engage with them unless they complete their pre-score, because of exactly what you say. He's had too many bad examples where business owners get to the end of the line on signing day and they're like, you know what, I can't do it because I don't have a pull factor. I don't have the, my equivalent of going to be a filmmaker. And I think it's a really interesting insight. So it's an important piece of the puzzle for sure.
Yeah. Another thing I want to talk about with you guys is, like, one of the things I see a lot in the market is I look at sellers, and I typically put those sellers into three buckets, right? Bucket one is the seller that wants maximum value, most of the cash at close, and is prepared to play with a trade buyer, right? So they're prepared for the brain damaging due diligence, the extended process, and I wouldn't say fear, but the acknowledgement that that trade buyer is potentially gonna upset the apple cart. They might change the brand, the culture, the relationships with the customers. They might hack away at the income statement. They're going to make some changes, right? Now, about a third of sellers that I meet, they're fine with that. They just want the money, typically younger, more tech, SaaS, e-com type deals. Bucket two is the seller that just wants a partner, wants support. So they're looking at financial buyers. They're looking at a private equity firm or a family office that will come in. They'll give them, they'll elevate them up to owner investor. They'll bring in a CEO or a team that can drive a lot of the growth. They cash them out a bit on day one, and then they provide additional capital either for acquisitions or additional working capital to organically scale. And then they'll get a second bite of the cherry, right? So see a lot of those guys. And then the third camp, which is where I focus a lot, and so do my students, is the seller that wants what I call the safe, trusted pair of hands. That they care about their legacy, they care about their customer base, they care about their employees, they care about the culture that they've built, and they're prepared to either take a slightly more creative deal or a lower valuation deal in general to get the best buyer, not necessarily the most expensive buyer. Do you see a lot of that with a lot of the interactions that I guess you're more in camp number one and a bit of camp number two, because I think with you taking them through the Value Builder system, I think you're removing a lot of that, what I call distressed seller psychology. So whenever I'm vetting a business, I always give the seller something that I call a MUD score, right? How motivated are they to do a deal? What's their level of urgency? And what's their distress level, right? Because urgency is really important. If somebody's like, hey, I'm sick, I can't be in this business for much longer. My team really need a new leader. We need extra capital to take it forward. I can't wait 4 months for you to do an SBA 7A loan, or I can't wait 3 months for you to go and raise other forms of capital. I need to come out of this deal super, super quickly. And as you know, most buyers, they're not sat on tens of millions of dollars of cash, to kind of do those deals. So how do you see like that market mixing up with all of the things that you do?
Yeah, I think those all three exist in the marketplace for sure. I think the secret and what we really try to preach is that once you have a business that can thrive without you, you've got the ultimate poker hand.
Yeah.
You can really maximize the things that are important to you. And so you can entertain an offer from a strategic acquirer. You can look at a private equity group and drive the terms that are most interesting to you. And you can also likewise to talk to someone who is suggesting a more creative deal that protects your employees in the process and your legacy. And I think all those things are possible. Whereas you start to narrow down your options if you don't build it so that it can thrive without you, right? So if the business is deeply dependent on you personally as the owner, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here with you, Carl, but your listeners may benefit from this. If it's dependent on you personally, there's sort of two scenarios that usually come about. One is that much of the valuation is put on an earnout, which is at risk, where future payment is at risk if you've got to hit a certain set of goals as an employee of another company. The other is, as you suggest, the second bite of the cherry. It's this rolling equity, which on the surface may sound perfectly reasonable, and oftentimes it is. It can be a great way to build wealth if the acquiring private equity group has the second sort of act. If they don't, however, you can end up being in the minority shareholder in a business you don't control, and that can leave you penniless, or at least the second tranche without any value. I did an interview with a guy named Ryan Moran, who rolled about 45% of his equity.
I love Ryan. He's a very, very good friend of mine.
There you go. Well, he did. He was one of my favorite guests. And he shared his story on the show and talked a lot about how he rolled a bunch of equity, and ultimately that went to zero because the private equity group brought in a CEO who didn't know his business, and the rest is history. So the moral of the story is, the more options you have at your disposal, the more offers, the more you're in the driver's seat, and the more you can determine and dictate your terms. Like some people, for example, they're very loyal to their employees, right? Like the employees are the ones that brought me to the dance. They're the ones who took risk on me, and they feel deeply, deeply loyal that the employees get taken care of. And in many cases, they'll take a worse deal financially if they feel comfortable that those employees are going to be taken care of.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big component. So again, once you've got a business that can thrive without you, you're not doing all the work or, owning all the client relationships, customer relationships. You've got, the ultimate poker hand in the game of life.
Yeah. And I've got direct experience of both of those things, actually. So, I saw one of my companies 2019, just before COVID, to a, $1 billion corporate, on, a kind of a creative, primarily earn-out structure, and they just didn't culturally fit. A $1 billion company buying a $5 million company is like, it was destined to fail, right? Culturally, it wasn't going to fit, and they, obviously decided that they didn't want it anymore, and I got it back for a crazy low discount on creative terms. But on the other side, like the first deal I ever did actually was to that point of legacy and employee protection. So when I left the corporate M&A world, so after some time on Wall Street, I worked in PE, and then I worked for Hewlett Packard. So I was buying technology businesses, and I became a father for the second time, decided to kind of like leave that world, and I decided to become a business broker actually. And I found this transportation company to buy, and I found a great buyer, big exit. And the day before closing, the seller pulled out because he realized that the buyer was going to just wreck the company, right? Get rid of all the employees and just trash the legacy that they built. And I actually said, well, I'll buy the company. I'll before ESOPs became really popular, but I'll involve employee ownership. I'm going to give senior managers like big percentage ownerships. But it's going to be a leverage buyout, right? I don't really want to put any on capital into this. Might put a bit in, but I'm going to be financing. This was a UK deal. I'm going to be financing, the assets in the business. And then there was a lot of surplus cash in the bank. And you probably know this, like in England, if you sell the stock of a business rather than the assets, you only pay 10% tax versus like 38, right? It's like a massive difference. So what you see in a lot of UK businesses is when they're about to sell, they start to stockpile the cash, because if they take it out as a distribution, they'll pay 32.5%. But if they leave it in the business and they sell it as an add-on to the deal price, they're only going to pay 10 on it, right? So I was able to use some of that financing, some of that cash to kind of structure the deal. And that was my entree really into being a micro PE guy doing leverage buyouts. It's because I found a seller that was less interested about the deal terms, was more interested about the safety of that buyer and the protection of the company that they built. And I do see that a lot, mostly in traditional industries, engineering, manufacturing, home services, construction, less so in tech or e-com or even professional services. But it goes back to the point I made when I made the little rant. Like a lot of these businesses where they feel like that, they've not adopted a value approach to their business. They've only adopted an income approach.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that may serve them well in the short term, but I think once they start to think of their business as an asset and their job as the owner is to maximize the asset, it does change the way they think about the company, the decisions that they make, and ultimately the outcome. It's great to see how the movie ends. Like if you know how the movie ends, if you know what acquirers look at and want in a business, if you have that in your head, you can start making decisions very early in your life cycle to maximize the value of that business. I think too many times business owners don't know how the movie ends. They, keep their head down, they're running their business, they're making their widget, whatever, and they pull up 10 years down the road and say, okay, now I want to sell. But they've made decisions years ago that really hamper the value of the company. And so, we see that all the time. So better to know how the movie ends, whether you want to sell or not is kind of irrelevant. It's like, I want to know what the end game looks like.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to talk about the book just for a little minute, because I'm actually writing a book right now. I'm about halfway through. I get up at 5 a.m. I do my 1,500 words a day. And the inspiration for my book, I actually got from Built to Sell. So what I love about Built to Sell is it's a fable, right? It's a fable about a business owner called Alex that's pretty frustrated, working in his business, not on his business, doesn't have a predictable revenue model, and gets coached and advised to switch up what he's doing to create a business that's got real value that someone's going to be able to monetize, right? And I read that book, and I've probably read this book 10 times, and it's mandatory reading for everybody inside of my coaching program. And the book I'm writing is called The Creative Dealmaker. So I took a class, right? Because I've written technical books, but technical books for me don't capture the emotion and drama of doing a deal, right? Everyone can write a book on buying a business, selling a business, valuation, deal structuring, due diligence, right? But they're like turgid books that capture the technical aspects. They don't capture the drama, the emotion, the psychology, the things that buyers go through and sellers go through. I've got so much deal heat right now. I'm buying a real estate coaching company, and I've fallen in love with this business, and I'm going against all of my teachings. I'm so rabid about this deal because emotions like everything. So my book's about, I took a class, I think it was Tom Clancy or James Patterson, to learn how to write a novel, how to build characters and stories and all that stuff. So I've got a buyer and I've got a seller, and they eventually meet through their various processes, and then they consummate a transaction, and it really talks to the drama and the emotion, and sellers, seller cold feet, buyer cold feet, like, oh no, the bank said no, what do I do? Do I abort? All those different things. So and like yours was the first book I read that really had that storytelling nature to take a complicated subject like grooming a business to be optimized for sale, but telling the story in a way that I think people can really resonate, right? And like I know a lot of people that they bought businesses in my program, they've grown them, and then they've sold them, and some people have done very, very well. They got a lot of inspiration from this book about understanding the emotional drivers through the different deal processes. So I want you to write more of these books. I'd love to see the next book where Alex becomes an angel investor, invests in a bunch of companies, and grooms them all and makes even more money. That would be so cool, right?
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, it's funny that you're originally from the UK because Random House is the publisher of Built to Sell in the United States, and Random House has a division called Penguin in the UK.
That's right.
You know Penguin, obviously, and Penguin's reaction when they first were asked if they wanted to acquire the UK rights was like, no, parables never sell in England. And so parables are a uniquely American thing. Not a uniquely, I shouldn't say that, but they generally don't sell as well in other countries, in particular in the UK. Penguin ultimately did buy the rights to Built to Sell in the UK market, and it sold just fine in the UK. But the point being that the parable format, famous by people like Pat Lencioni, Michael Gerber, is more common in the United States. I think there's an element of a parable that it's a delicate line, because I think, if you're too heavy on the story stuff, readers get frustrated, right? Like readers of business books, I mean, the demographics they tend to be young males. I mean, we can talk about why that is. Doesn't really matter. If you just look at the statistics, it's like young men are the readers of most business books. And so they're coming at the reader, like reading a business book with a very practical reason, right? They're reading, 8 ways to improve your email marketing or 16 ways to sign a commercial lease. Like they're very practical in what they're reading, right? So if you've got somebody who's like, I want to learn how to buy a business, well, they've got a practical reason for wanting to do that. Yeah. And they don't want their books to be kind of heavily weighed down in narrative. Equally, if you just give them a textbook, they'll never read it. So it's like this fine line, right, between giving them enough honey to take their medicine, like explaining the kind of key insight with enough coding so that it's like palatable, but not so much. Because I've seen some parables that are like 450 pages long, and it's like, the man walked down the street where the sun was bathing him in a beautiful heat in the morning, and his like it's like way too much, right? Yeah. And so I think there's a fine line, but I'm sure you'll nail it.
Yeah, and like I think I love parables, right? Because I think in some industries they're probably not needed, but I think when it comes to business, and especially when it comes to buying and selling businesses, I really do believe that in the micro cap market, deals in the $1 to $5 million range, they're a lot more about emotional psychology than they are about math. Like when I was a Wall Street guy, I used to do deals in the billions, and it's just all about financial engineering. There's a bit of psychology when you're buying a public company and you're trying to understand what public shareholders are going to do. But down on Main Street deals, like you've got a business owner, right? Boomer, started the business in the 80s. It's 40 years old, and they've spent more time in that business than they have with their own family, right? They're not generally being advised well by the marketplace. If they're in your program, great, but most of them aren't, right? So they don't know what they don't know. And I think it's a very lonely place sometimes as a seller, especially if you're a sole proprietor and you don't have multiple shareholders, and that's another set of problems, right? But I think being able to really understand the drama and the emotion of going through something like this, I think parables are essential in business. Like I read the book, it was one of the Traction books. I think it's called Get a Grip. Well, I read Traction. Okay, great book, how-to manual, technical, right? Great book. But then when you read Get a Grip, it puts the implementation of that system into real life and what can happen, right? So like one of the things in that book was like some major kind of consternations with some of the key employees, particularly I think it was the financial controller, and that was causing like so many problems as they were evolving. You can't pick that up in a technical book. To understand that in a real story and to be mindful of that and to be able to kind of circumvent that, I think is so powerful. So I'm all for fables. I'm going to write a bunch of these. I've discovered a passion in myself to write. I can't believe it, right? I literally can't believe it. It's not gone to the editor yet. They might rip it apart. But I love writing like these stories about business. So once I've done Creative Dealmaker, the next one will probably be a book about roll-ups, because I'm doing a lot of roll-ups right now. in different industries, which, you know, are challenging, but they're also emotionally charged. So, yeah, maybe I need to do Value Builder System, get out of all my businesses. I own 26 companies today. You know, I spend a lot of time doing that stuff, and I just love to sit down and write. You know, I love the book, The Firm, the old John Grisham book, where, you know, the mafia are involved. I'd love to do like a book about, you know, the mafia of like invested in a PE fund, and they're doing deals and they're shooting.
That's a good
buyers.
idea.
I'd love to do stuff like that, right? So I'd love. I think that'll be the final act in my career. I think I can see myself backing away over the next 3 to 5 years. I think when I hit mid-50s, I'd love to just sit back and write every day. But anyway, what about you? What's next for you? You know, what do you see yourself doing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, you've got your pull factor dialed in, which is great, which is awesome. Yeah, I mean, we've launched a new software product called VidGuide, which is SOPs, video-based SOPs, which has been a passion for us for a while. So that's a project that I'm leaning into quite a bit, and we're excited about Value Builder. We've got a ton of new products that we're launching. So I'm super excited about that. And I've got a president who runs the company Value Builder. His name's Sam Mendelson, and it's great to have a partner in crime. And as we go forward, it leaves me out of the kind of some of the doing, which is great, and I can sort of stay a little bit more strategic. So I love that, and I don't think I've got any immediate changes on the horizon.
Great. Well, I think you know, the whole Value Builder System and your whole ethos of creating value for business owners and getting them ready financially and emotionally to be able to pull that trigger and do something is absolutely what this market needs. You know, we've all read the stats. There's tens of trillions of dollars of businesses that are going to change hands within the next 10 to 20 years. And I don't think the majority of that market is really prepared for that. And, you know, I hate reading that statistic all the time, that 62% of business owners' exit strategy is just to liquidate the company, right? And, you know, whether they get the right value for that or not, you know, they're putting people out of work, and they're destroying the legacies that they've built over all of those years. So, you know, I think it should be mandated that every business owner goes through this journey and creates real value. And if, you know, as me as a buyer, if I'm paying more money for that, I don't really mind, because the more sophisticated the business, the more valuable it is, the easier it is in reality to actually raise capital to buy it. So, you know, there's no end of capital for best-in-class deals. I just don't see that many of them. I think 1 in 20 businesses that I look at is out there, and it's worth a lot of money. Most of them, you know, I find them, you know, very, very ordinary. But so thank you, John Warrillow. An absolute pleasure to kind of jam with you today. I'd love to come back on yours at any time where we want to riff this even more. But where can people get hold of you? I want people to buy this book. Go on Amazon, buy this book. It's absolutely, if you want to buy or sell a company, please read this book. It's a super quick read. There's some really good insights. And I love at the end of every chapter, you've got like the advisor's takeaways. So you've got the fable bit, and it's like, right, okay, here's the 10 things that you need to care about, and then you move on to the next one. So how else can people get hold of you? I want every business owner in the world to know you and have access to your stuff, so that you can make them happier and richer through selling their businesses. How can people find you?
BuiltToSell.com. All roads lead there, and you'll find social links, and we're into episode 450 of Built to Sell Radio, the podcast. So there's tons of stuff there. Just BuiltToSell.com.
Okay. Well, absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for giving us the time, and I will see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Carl.
Bye, John.